I grew up in a quiet coastal town that always felt safe. Our neighborhood was tucked away on a winding street with tall pine trees on both sides, and the row of houses almost felt like a small private community. Nothing much ever happened there, and I'd never had any kind of real scary moment in my life until this one night. At the time, I was 12. I had just finished a babysitting basics course at our local community center. It taught us how to handle basic safety situations and even CPR. I'd practiced on my younger cousins and watched my little brother often enough that I felt pretty confident. So when our family friends asked if I could watch their 2 kids for the evening, I agreed. The kids were easy, a boy and a girl, both in elementary school. Their parents said they'd be back around 10:30. My own parents lived down the street, so I wasn't worried in the slightest. When I arrived that evening, everything was calm. The kids had already eaten dinner. They were polite, the kind of kids who actually follow bedtime rules without the usual protests. At one point, I even told them they could finish the cartoon we were watching, but they shook their heads and said they needed to brush their teeth first. That made my job simple. By a little after 8, they were tucked into bed. I turned off their bedroom lights, tiptoed out, and went downstairs to the living room. The parents' house was beautifully designed, open, airy, with a big back wall made entirely of tall glass windows looking out into the woods. From the couch, you could see the stretch of trees behind the house, their shapes fading into the darkness. I put on the TV and settled in with their old golden retriever, Buddy, who curled up at my feet. About 20 minutes later, I thought I saw movement just beyond the windows, something light-colored slipping past. At first, I told myself it was probably a deer. This area had plenty of them, and it wasn't unusual to see one cross a yard at night. But being 11 in a big, quiet house, my imagination started to kick in. I decided to step into the kitchen and call my parents, just for reassurance. This was before I had my own cell phone, so I used the wall phone near the counter. The kitchen had a clear view through a big archway leading back to the living room and those giant windows. Buddy followed me in, laying down at my feet while I dialed our home number. My mom picked up, and I told her what I'd seen. Her voice made me feel better right away. I told her it was fine, no need to send my dad over. We said goodnight, and I hung up. I knelt down next to Buddy, rubbing his ears. The TV was still flickering in the background, casting bits of light across the living room. That's when something in the distance caught my eye, a small flicker of white moving between the trees. I automatically thought flashlight, but figured maybe it was a neighbor cutting through the woods. I kept watching. The light got closer and closer. My stomach tightened. Whoever it was, they were heading directly toward the back of the house. By the time the light reached the yard, my heart was pounding. The beam suddenly shifted, sweeping across the living room, and then stopped, right on my face. I froze. The brightness made it impossible to see who was holding it. Buddy, half asleep, didn't react at all, which somehow made everything more unsettling. For what felt like forever, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body felt like it wasn't mine anymore. The light moved away from me for a second, then swung back again. This time, I could make out part of a face above the beam, but the shadows hid the details. Hollow-looking eyes, the curve of a cheekbone. I wanted to run upstairs, grab the kids, call the police, anything, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. It was like every second stretched out painfully. Then, darkness. The flashlight clicked off. That sudden change snapped me out of it. I grabbed the phone, ready to dial 911, already thinking whether I should hide in the upstairs bedroom or try to rush the kids out the front door toward my parents' house. Before I could decide, a sharp bang rattled through the house, like someone had hit one of the doors hard. My chest tightened. Then I heard knocking, fast, heavy knocking on the laundry room door that led in from the garage. My immediate thought was, I didn't remember if I'd locked the main garage door leading to the backyard. Then came a voice. Calm, familiar. "Hey, it's me. Open up." It was my dad. Still shaky, I stumbled to the door and unlocked it. He was grinning. In fact, he could barely speak at first because he was laughing. That's when I found out what had happened. Even though I'd told my mom not to send him, she thought it'd be good for him to stop by anyway, just to be safe. Instead of knocking at the front, he'd gone around the back and decided to check the yard with our flashlight. He'd seen me through the glass, but didn't realize how creepy it looked from my perspective. He shined the light at me, then on his face from below, thinking I'd recognize him instantly. But from inside the dark living room, the shadows made him look like a total stranger. When he saw how pale I was once I opened the door, he understood he'd accidentally scared me half to death. He thought it was hilarious. Me, it took the rest of the night for my heartbeat to go back to normal.
When I was 19, I used to babysit for a single mom I'll call Karen. She had 3 boys. Alan was 4, Ben was 6, and Caleb was 8. I had been working for her for several months, and by then I knew their routines pretty well. Alan, the youngest, was an easy toddler. He was playful but rarely caused trouble. Caleb was the oldest and spent most of his time glued to his video games or watching TV. Ben, though, was different. He could be sweet one moment and stubborn the next. He was picky about food, didn't like going to bed on time, and sometimes resisted anything he didn't want to do. Kieran worked night shifts and often wouldn't get home until close to midnight. My schedule fit hers well because my college classes were in the afternoons, so I could babysit for her during the week. I had gotten to know her well enough that we would sometimes talk for a while before she left for work, and she'd usually tell me how the boys' day had gone so I knew what to expect. One ordinary weeknight, I fed the boys dinner, and afterward, Caleb asked if I'd play a few rounds of Wii tennis with him after his brothers went to bed. We tucked Alan in first, since his bedtime was earliest. Then it was Ben's turn. I read him a short bedtime story, turned off the light, and told him goodnight. Caleb was waiting for me in the living room, and I told him we could play 2 rounds of tennis before he had to go up and get changed for bed himself. Halfway through our game, I heard Ben calling for me from upstairs. His voice had a hint of urgency, so I paused the game and went up to check on him. When I walked in, he was sitting up in bed with a worried look on his face. He told me there was a monster in his closet. I tried to reassure him, saying that monsters aren't real, but I didn't want to dismiss his fear entirely, so I told him I'd leave the closet door slightly open so he could see it was empty. He nodded, seeming a little better, so I went back downstairs to Caleb. We finished our game, and Caleb went upstairs to change into his pajamas. I was alone in the kitchen watching TV when I heard Ben call out again, only this time his voice sounded more frightened than before. I headed up to his room and found him hiding completely under his covers. When I pulled the blanket back, he whispered that the monster was still in the closet. Only this time, he added something new. He said he could hear it moving. I glanced at the closet door. It was shut. For a second, I debated ignoring it, but something about the look in his eyes made me take him more seriously this time. I asked if he wanted me to check. He quickly shook his head and told me not to. I took a few steps toward the closet anyway, and that's when he whispered, "Don't." His little voice was so tense that it made me pause, and right then, I heard it too. It was faint, but unmistakable. A soft shuffle, almost like someone lightly bumping the inside of the door. My stomach tightened. Ben's wide eyes stared at me, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "See?" At that point, I didn't waste time trying to figure it out. I picked him up and carried him to his little brother's room. On the way, I stopped by the bathroom where Caleb was brushing his teeth and told him to come with us. We went into Alan's room and I locked the door. Alan's bedroom connected to Karen's bedroom through a shared bathroom, so once the kids were inside, I stepped into the bathroom and called Karen on my phone. I spoke in a low voice and told her there might be an animal in the closet because I had heard noises myself. There was a pause on the other end, and then she quietly told me to check the closet while she stayed on the line. I didn't like the idea, but I went back down the hall to Ben's room. The sight that met me made my skin crawl. The closet door was now slightly open. I hadn't touched it, and I knew Ben hadn't either. My voice trembled as I told Karen what I was seeing, and that's when she blurted out, "Get the boys out of the house now! It might be my ex!" Everything in me went cold. I scooped up Alan, told Caleb and Ben to follow me, and we made our way toward the front door. As we reached the hallway, there was a loud slam somewhere in the house. My heart pounded. I peeked around the corner toward the living room, saw no one there, but the front door was closed. Whoever it was must have just left. I locked the door immediately and called the police. Karen rushed home just as the officers did. She told them about her ex, explaining that she'd recently blocked his number and that he had a history she didn't want to get into. The police couldn't prove it was him, but they advised her to change the locks right away. That night stayed with me for a long time. Afterward, Karen made sure her kids stayed with relatives when she worked late. I eventually stopped babysitting for her, but I kept thinking about something. When she told me to open that closet, she already suspected it might be her ex. And if I had opened it right away, I might have been face to face with him.
Until I turned 12, I always had a babysitter whenever my parents went out. It didn't matter if they were only going to be gone for a couple of hours or the whole night. There was always someone there. Being an only child, they said it was safer this way. At first, I didn't mind. Most of the sitters were friendly, talked to me, made snacks, and sometimes even played games. I never thought much about it. But all of that changed with the last babysitter I ever had. After that night, my parents stopped hiring anyone to watch me, completely. His name was James. He was 18, and my parents had hired him before. This was only the second time he'd been asked to stay overnight while they were away. Back then, I didn't have the words to describe it, but now I can look back and clearly see that something about him was off. He was the kind of person who barely spoke, avoided normal conversation, and just seemed awkward. Not shy in a harmless way, but awkward in a way that made you feel something wasn't quite right. He had this strange sense of personal space, or more accurately, no sense of it at all. That night started in a completely ordinary way. I had eaten dinner, changed into my pajamas, and was sitting on the couch in the living room watching my favorite TV show. James was supposed to be upstairs in the guest room my parents had told him to use. But at some point, without a sound, he came down the stairs and walked into the living room. He didn't say hello or ask about the show. Instead, he sat down on the couch, only not next to me, but behind me, slightly to the side, where I could feel his presence, even though I was facing the TV. I tried to focus on my show, but after a while, curiosity got the better of me. I turned my head and found him just looking at me. His expression wasn't angry or happy, it was just blank. It was strange enough that I felt a sudden jolt in my chest, though I didn't know why at the time. Out of nervousness, I gave a little laugh, as if to break the weird silence between us. That's when he finally spoke. He asked if I wanted to play a video game. I wasn't really into video games. My friends, who were mostly boys, played them, but I didn't. Yet for some reason, I said yes. Maybe it was because I didn't want to be rude. Instead of pulling out something small like a handheld console, James went straight upstairs into my dad's room. That struck me as odd.
I had no memory of my dad telling him to go in there. A few minutes later, James came back holding my dad's Xbox 360. Somehow, he knew exactly where it was. He plugged it in and set everything up in the living room. The game he put on had a science fiction feel to it. I'd later learn it was Halo 2. I tried to play, but within minutes, it became painfully obvious I had no idea what I was doing. In that short time, my character on the screen died again and again. James laughed softly, not in a teasing way, but more like he was watching something he expected. Then he stood up and moved behind me, leaning over so his arms reached around my shoulders. He told me he'd show me how to play the right way. Before I could react, his hands were covering mine on the controller. He began pressing buttons and moving the joystick, guiding my hands along with his. The problem was how close he was standing, so close that his entire upper body was leaning on my back. I felt trapped in my seat. For a moment, I sat there frozen, pretending to focus on the game, but my chest felt tight and heavy. I didn't like it, but I also didn't know what to say. This went on for longer than I was comfortable with, minutes that felt like much more. Finally, in the quietest, most nervous voice, I managed to say, "I don't like this game. I want to stop." There was a pause. Then James pulled his hands away, walked around the couch, and sat down again without a word. He picked up another controller and kept playing by himself. I told him I was going upstairs to watch TV in my room. He didn't respond. In my room, I turned on a light-hearted show and curled up in bed. The sound from the TV was comforting, and eventually, without meaning to, I drifted off to sleep. When I woke, the room was dark, except for the blue and white flickers from the TV screen. I sat up slowly. The mattress springs creaked under me. But in the middle of that noise, I caught what I thought was another sound. It was faint, a sort of shuffling, as if someone's clothes were brushing against something. I froze, holding my breath. My eyes scanned the room. The door was still closed, but something felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. That's when I saw it. The closet door wasn't shut all the way. It was open just enough to show a strip of darkness. I stared at that small gap, trying to decide if it had been like that earlier. Suddenly, the TV scene changed to a bright, almost white image. The burst of light spilled into the open crack of the closet, and in that light, I saw him. James was standing inside. The sight hit me like ice. My body reacted before my brain caught up. I gasped out loud. The noise gave me away, and James stepped forward slowly from the shadows. His arms were slightly raised, palms out like he was trying to calm me. His voice was low and drawn out when he said, "Shh, it's okay." Then, as he came closer, he added in almost a whisper, "You're really pretty, you know that?" I felt every muscle in my body lock. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my legs were heavy. I knew what was happening and that I had to get out. When he took another slow step toward me, I spotted the gap between him and the bed, the only path to the door. I didn't give myself time to hesitate. I darted sideways, squeezing past him before he could block me. Heart pounding, I ran downstairs as fast as I could, straight to my dad's home office. It was the only room in the house with a door that locked from the inside. I slammed it shut and locked it. My hands were shaking hard, but I forced myself to grab the phone from the desk and dial my dad's work number. While I was dialing, James started knocking, softly at first, then a little harder. His voice was just on the other side of the door, saying, "I'm not going to do anything. Please don't call your dad." I ignored him, clutching the phone. When my dad picked up, his tone changed immediately as soon as I told him what had happened. He told me to keep the office locked and wait until he got home. He said he'd be there in an hour. I sat in the office chair, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling and trying to hear if James was still nearby. After what felt like forever, the knocking stopped. The next sounds I heard were my dad's keys in the front door lock. By the time he came in, James was gone. It didn't end there. My parents had James's parents' contact information, and as soon as my dad heard the whole story, he called the police. Later that night, I had to explain it all again, this time to an officer who wrote down every detail. James was arrested not long afterwards on charges related to misconduct toward a minor. After that, my parents never hired another babysitter for me. In fact, they said they'd rather trust me alone than risk something like that happening again. I didn't argue. Now, years later, I've grown up, moved on, and built a life far from that night. But I still think about it. Sometimes it's just a passing thought in the middle of a busy day. Other times, it's when I'm alone at night and I remember jolting awake to see that half-open closet door. That image of James standing there in the glow from the TV will probably never leave me.